Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is KidNativeBloodyElbow.com with the infamous and patented. No, wait, that's not this show. This is the Bathrobe review. No bathrobe. It's too late in the day, and it's summer, getting close to summertime, so I'm not going to be wearing the bathrobe as much for these. But anyway, this is for the Bellator 120 pay-per-view debut. Wasn't planning on doing this, but I had more to say. Got some feedback on the sixth round we did last night. Those post-fight six rounds we do are probably the most controversial things we do in terms of viewer feedback, because we get a lot of viewers who are, hyped up from the pay-per-view, have never heard of us before, and are seeing our stuff for the first time. So we get some interesting feedback. Also get some yuck from people who just don't get what we're trying to do. So I kind of wanted to explain what I was doing. Plus, I think this might have been the most significant MMA event of the year in terms of the implications for the future of the business, future of the industry, future of fighters, future of fans. So I just had some more things to say. I wanted to say about it, and so we're gonna go. I mean, for those of you who missed the post-fight review last night, I mean, I skipped the preliminary card. I was fighting a fever. When you have little kids, man, they bring home these bugs from the nursery, and it's brutal. Anyway, the whole month has been just an endless sequence of passing bugs back and forth. So I skipped the prelims on Spike.com. Watched the prelims on Spike TV. The notable thing was obviously Shambalat Shamalayev getting his arm broken in a Kimura. Hate to see that. Definitely part of the sport. Goes tradition going all the way back to Helio Gracie getting his arm snapped by Kimura himself back in the day in Brazil. And hats off to Fabricio Guerrero for pulling it off. Shamalayev, like Zane said, made a dumb mistake, and instead of escaping the grappling exchange, reinitiated it. That's a fairly common mistake you see fighters who are primarily strikers make sometimes. That they they've learned enough grappling to screw up. So that's kind of what happened there last night. And sorry, I got distracted by text. But then Marcin Held and Nate Jolly. Held is one of the few Bellator fighters that's original to Bellator that's really caught my eye. One of the last submission artists, pure submission artists in MMA, came through in a tough fight over Nate Jolly and got the submission. Held was fighting on short notice, which made it a catchweight fight. So Held's somebody to keep an eye on. I'd love to see the submissions. Submissions are in danger in MMA. The rate of submissions is going down. The rule set and the judging, punishes doing work from the guard. So it's very hard to anyway, it's an endangered species, as it were. And it's the reason I first came to love MMA was because of Royce Gracie and what he showed us about how somebody who's got training and technique and bravery and presence of mind can beat somebody who doesn't have those techniques, who's much bigger and more aggressive. And so that was inspirational to me as a little guy. Never did train enough to learn to do any of that, but that's neither here nor there. And then Sheik Congo and Eric Smith, that was just a shit show. I mean, Sheik Congo was kind of a bust, not a bust in the UFC, but just a mediocre heavyweight, and now he's a mediocre heavyweight in Bellator. He's 39. I think there was a point at which he would have taken the Bellator title, but he had a shot against Minikov and lost it. So unfortunate for Bellator, because now they've got a Minikov Volkov rematch for their next heavyweight title. Heavyweight's very shallow division in MMA, and they're just not getting any momentum there. Volkov beat Blagoy Ivanov in the show. And I do want to remind you, if you like these, give us a like at the beginning. Need to remind our regular fans to do that, because we got killed on YouTube last night in the sixth round with a lot of, I presume, noobs giving us the thumbs down. And of course, it was a shit show. I mean, I made a flagrant factual mistake about Ivanov. I didn't remember that this was, he's had like 3 fights since he recovered from his stabbing, and I totally forgot. And I'll just tell you the truth. I mean, this is the deal with the Kid Nate shows. This is trying to give you a fan's perspective. Now, some of our fans, Connor Rubish, Dallas Winston, Zane Simon, are extremely well informed on minutia. Eugene Robinson is a friggin' purple belt. who's fought professionally, written a whole book on it. But Eugene and I don't keep up with all the day in, day out latest doings. And I'm not going to lie and pretend that I've been watching Bellator all season. Man, I can barely keep up with the crap the UFC is spewing out. I dip in and out of Bellator as a fight interests me. I'm trying to keep my fan perspective. I learned a long time ago that I don't want to be on the inside of the sport. I don't want to be an insider. I want to keep my perspective of a guy looking at these fights through a screen and share that. Some people seem to like it, so I'm going to keep doing it. It's been successful enough. But I just want to warn viewers, like, if you're looking for up to the minute, every fact right style stuff, go watch Jordan Breen. That's not what I'm going to be doing here. If you want professional stuff, my colleague Ariel Hawani and Luke Thomas, those guys have it going on in MMA fighting. Bloody Elbow is more of a pro-am, fan view approach of these things, so it's going to be rough and sloppy. It just is. And I'm a sloppy guy, so that's it. I'm never going to get all the facts right. Zane Simon, Connor, Dallas, those guys, they're up on this shit. And Zane corrected me on that mistake. I just wanted to comment on that because one reader really jumped my shit about it. But anyway, Tito Ortiz, Alexander Slamenko. I skipped the Michael Page, Ricky Rainey fight that opened the pay-per-view. Page is one of the most interesting prospects Bellator has. Somebody pointed out he definitely has holes in his game. I mean, anybody who's bringing that kind of traditional martial arts striking style to MMA is going to have holes in their game. I mean, there's a major theoretical dispute between people who come from a Muay Thai background, a traditional kickboxing background, or a boxing background, and those are disciplines that focus on high efficiency moves, whereas karate is a completely different stylistic base with a different philosophy. And so you see somebody like Lyoto Machida, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, Michael Venom Page, they're going to do things that look flagrantly wrong to somebody coming from a Muay Thai background or a boxing background. It's just a different approach. It's a different philosophy in the hands of the right athlete. Sometimes, Lyoto Machida, UFC champion. I mean, and Michael Page is somebody, I don't know that he could ever rise to the level of UFC champion or best in the world, but I definitely think he's an exciting, fun fighter that people will pay to watch. And that's what's really valuable. I could care less about who is the best fighter on earth. I mean, I've learned enough about this game to know that the best fighter on earth in a one-man sport, that could change any day. You have a guy come in injured, come in after a bad training camp, come in after a divorce, rack up some gambling losses, just be in a bad frame of mind and lose to a much inferior fighter that he beat 9 out of 10 times. So I don't think that we're ever going to definitively know who is the best fighter in the world. Like, you can figure out who is the best football team in the world because it's such a mammoth project to build a professional football team that only a handful of organizations can do it. As far as professional fighters, there's lots of guys, that could walk in and beat top UFC fighters any day. Anyway, I'm rambling all over the place here, so bear with me. But Page, and also I like what Zane said last night about Page being very smart. He seems to be very focused on staying out of the Bellator tar trap, which Eddie Alvarez and so many other fighters have been sucked into. Ben Askren, was sucked into it, wanted to move into the UFC for various reasons. They didn't want him. He set out a whole year to avoid the Bellator matching time. Bellator didn't want him back, and the UFC didn't want him, which is crazy. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. But Page, as somebody that, if you're a UFC fan and you have hopes to see him escape from Bellator, he might be somebody who's going to do his 3 fights in Bellator and get out. He's only got 1 more fight on his contract, so we'll see. And we're going to have some a story this week by John S. Nash. There's some scary stuff. The Bellator contracts, if anything, have gotten even worse. That's what we're hearing. We're still working on the story, and we'll tell you more about it. But they're just adding extension after extension. Their takeaway from the Alvarez thing was we weren't restrictive enough with our trying to hold on to our fighters, which is crazy town. But let's run through the card, and then I'll get into my riffing. Tito Ortiz and Alexander Slamenko, kind of pointless, but you still care about Tito. I mean, here's somebody we've been watching for well over 16 years, well known. He's on so many Ultimate Fighters, just a mainstay of the UFC for a decade and a half, and somebody that was never quite likable but kind of lovable, and he's still in that same boat. I mean, he's a daffy idiot. The stuff he was saying about God, I mean, just God made me a tool. He sure did, Tito. He sure did. But at the same time, if you can parse out through the bad grammar what he's trying to say, his whole bit about, look, I'm here to inspire you guys. I'm a, late 30s. I've had all these neck injuries and back injuries and surgeries, and I'm recovering and I'm back. And so, hey, if that's the story he wants to tell, that's awesome. But at the same time, it reminds me of nothing so much as Evan Tanner, his final hurrah in the UFC, where, Tanner, somebody who's a UFC champion, one of my personal favorite fighters, came from my own neck of the woods, the Texas Panhandle, just an epic legend of MMA, and bowed out at the UFC for a couple years, and frankly was just an alcoholic. Was trying to drink himself to death, then pulled out of that spiral and started training again, and came back. He had this whole vision of how Army. I can't remember. It wasn't Army of One, but it was along those same themes. Army of One's the Army thing. I can't remember what his catchphrase was, but he was like, "I'm going to show people one person can make a difference." And he was doing really cool stuff. He was going and painting, preschool gyms for charity and doing really cool things, but he had shot his physical resources with the alcoholism, and when he came back for his final run in the UFC, he was just a shadow of his former self, and that seems to be pretty clearly what Tito is. Stylistically, he never evolved. Once he never solved sprawl and brawl. He never developed a striking game good enough to set up his takedowns and stop being the overwhelming force he was in the initial phase of his career. He has improved his submission grappling enough to beat a blown-up middleweight once he gets him down on the ground. But if Shlemenko had true light heavyweight knockout power, he wouldn't have had that chance because Shlemenko stuffed his first 3 or 4 takedowns. Anyway, I'm not sure where they go with that, but Tito is a personality that's compelling. So he's probably not worth quite the money Spike is paying him, but he's an asset for sure. And if he wants to fight and put his health on the line, and Bellator wants to feature that and Spike, by all means, people will watch it. I don't know how much longer or who they can put him in against, so I'll get that in a second. Will Brooks and Michael Chandler, a great fight. Back and forth. I think Chandler obviously was focused on preparing for Eddie Alvarez, his third match with Eddie Alvarez, and so Brooks was kind of an unknown. And Brooks was preparing for a different fight. He was supposed to fight Nate Jolly, but he took the short notice to step up, took the opportunity, and got that interim Bellator title, which doesn't mean that much, but Bellator's in the odd position of their lightweight title being their marquee title. I mean, Alvarez has been their main guy, even though he's basically been an enemy of Bellator for 2 years now. And so we'll get to that dynamic in a minute. But Brooks fought a great fight. He was able to adjust and put that body triangle, and Chandler wasn't. Chandler keeps going to his back and expecting he can roll off. I mean, going to his stomach and expecting to be able to explode out of the bad position. And Brooks adjusted, went from the 2 hooks into the body triangle, and Chandler didn't have an answer for that. Now, Brent Brookhouse on Bloody Elbow was saying that he thought Chandler won the fight, and I think if I watched it again and scored it closely, I might come to that conclusion. But as a fan watching it casually, I thought Brooks had the momentum and did the things. Chandler was the one with the bloody face, and just as someone who wasn't watching it especially closely, I thought Brooks totally won that. I was totally happy to see him win. Same thing with the Rampage Jackson King Mo fight. I mean, sure, I could see where you could score that fight for King Mo, but I scored it for Rampage Jackson, and I'll watch it again and see if I stick by that. But the main takeaway from the Rampage King Mo fight was these guys are just shadows of their former selves. It looked like Rampage was hitting a lot harder than he was because of the way Mo was slipping away from the punches, and a really self-defeating, like people talk a lot about former UFC lightweight champion Benson Henderson no selling his opponents when they hurt him. Like the way Bendo fights, you can really land a good shot, and he's going to shrug it off like nothing happened, and that convinces the judges. King Mo was doing a very effective strategy as far as avoiding those kill shots by Rampage, and if you're fighting Rampage, number one goal is don't get knocked out. And he didn't get knocked out, so that's a win there. But the way he was stumbling around to get away from the punches made it look like he had just been hurt. And I really think that a lot of those times he hadn't been. He was just using some ungainly-looking motion to get away. So I'm not upset about the decision because, frankly, I think King Mo looked pretty crappy. But here's the deal. The dynamic, the frisson, the stuff people are talking about is King Mo's attacks on Bjorn Rebney. And so I'm just rambling all over the place. Let me get to my notes here. How was the show? Overall, it was entertaining. I thought it was $35 worth of action for sure. However, where do they go from here? They don't, the Rampage King Mo fight doesn't set up I don't think it sets up a rematch. I mean, maybe it does, but those guys can shit talk each other in a very entertaining fashion. But I think King Mo can shit talk Bjorn Rebney in a plenty entertaining fashion. The real thing is Mo does not look like a shadow of himself. I mean, he's a ghost of what he used to be, and so he's just physically diminished. I think a King Mo Tito Ortiz fight. Now those guys can shit talk. I'm sure they can develop a real head of steam of dislike for each other, and it should be real entertaining. Maybe that could be a next pay-per-view headliner. I mean, it's not going to be high-level sport, but I mean, who cares about high-level sport? This sport is fundamentally a spectacle-driven thing. I mean, Hoist Gracie versus Dan Severn or Ken Shamrock, those were spectacles. A sport evolved out of that. But let's not lose the thread here. This is a spectacle-driven sport. If we want the sport to continue, it's got to keep that spectacle aspect. And I think I'm a big fan of Sam Kaplan's work and Joe Silva and Sean Shelby at the UFC, but I think there's this tendency on this part of fight nerds to want to book these fights as if it's the NCAA wrestling tournament or a tennis tournament or something. It's not a pure sport. You can't do that. You've got to do it more like Strikeforce did or Pride did, where there's a mix of compelling sport and compelling spectacle. That's what people want to see, is that mix of crazy and compelling sport. They want the meat on the bone of the legitimate sport, but they also want the sizzle of the craziness. And so, Bellator had the ingredients there. I mean, between the Brooks and Chandler match, that was real legit sport, high quality MMA right there. But the Jackson Rampage King Mo fight, the Tito fight, that was freak show. Michael Page is a little bit, he's not freak show, but he's on the Nick Diaz level of, wow, really entertaining fighter, has some stylistic holes in his game. I mean, I'd be very curious to see how Michael Page would have fared against Ben Askren. I presume Askren would have just held him down like he does everybody else. But I mean, stylistically. But the dynamic I want to get to is the most compelling emotional narrative in Bellator right now, and it has been for years, is the fighters versus Bellator thing, which isn't good for your organization. I mean, one of the things that's really seen the UFC through a lot of ups and downs has been fans' loyalty to Dana White. And even though, I've gone on for hours and hours about the downsides of Dana White, there's a lot of upside to Dana White. And fundamentally, people are like, hey, he's a guy like me. He's a fan. He tells it like it is. He's a straight shooter. He can be an asshole to fighters, but he's, ultimately kind of fair to most of them. And he let Tito come back and fight. I mean, he can generally sit down and between him and Lorenzo Fertitta work out a deal with people they're having issues with. However, that's kind of devolved to a point where they've got the Diaz brothers sitting on a shelf at a point when they have no or very few legitimate draws. I mean, they've got John Jones and Ronda Rousey, who neither one of them are, Brock Lesnar in his heyday or GSP in his heyday. They're both compelling figures, but they're not quite right. They're not hitting on all cylinders. They don't really have a great opponent for Rousey. Same thing with Jones. Fans have kind of reservations about both of them. And here the Diaz brothers are on the shelf wanting more money. And I mean, I saw Jeremy Botter on Bleacher Report writing, the UFC is right to not give the Diaz brothers what they want. Are you kidding me? If you pay the Diaz brothers $500,000 and you get 50,000 extra pay-per-view buys, you just made $1 million profit. Like, they'll make an extra $1.5 million in pay-per-view money. That's worth the $500,000. The Diaz brothers have learned a little bit about the business, seeing what guys get paid in boxing, seeing what guys like Gilbert Melendez was able to get paid when he leveraged going to Bellator and made the UFC exercise their matching option. These are kids, who realize you've only got one life to live, and you got to grab these opportunities. And Nick Diaz is just like, look, if it's not a big fight I'm going to make a lot of money on, it's not worth it to me. And I mean, I think the UFC is in a position where they need to do it. But back to Bellator, you got Bellator with this ongoing 3-year feud with Eddie Alvarez that was supposed to be resolved last night. And that is such a tragedy, I got to say, because the Alvarez narrative of Alvarez fighting Michael Chandler for the third time, Chandler's just a brutal stylistic matchup for him. I honestly feel like Alvarez was very lucky to get the decision in the second fight. I thought he put on a great fight both times. Both the matches were just incredible bouts, and it's sort of tragic there. Alvarez's contract mandates that he can have a trilogy with Chandler, and I think that's probably what they ought to do. Because even though they've been saying, we'll let Alvarez will fight the winner of this thing. Nobody cares about the title. Alvarez is leaving Bellator. I don't think you could put a gun to Alvarez's head and make him fight for Bellator any more than the one fight he has left on his contract. The deal is, the stakes are whether or not Alvarez goes out a winner and gets a really big deal from the UFC, or he goes out a loser and has to kind of crawl on his belly. I don't even know if the UFC would take him. So it's a very much sort of a repeat of the Ben Askren tragedy, where you've got this great fighter, very charismatic, and he got entangled with Bellator and had a bad experience, had a nightmarish experience. Spent a year spending all his money on a lawsuit that he ultimately settled, and now he's been injured, and so anyway, we'll just have to see. I mean, we don't know right now what the numbers are, how well they did. I think they need to get at least like 50,000 pay-per-view buys to make the money. Of course, Viacom, they've got a lot of money if they wanted to keep going back to pay-per-view, but they've done that with TNA and never really succeeded. And so, when they've got big salaries like Rampage Jackson and Tito Ortiz, it's hard to make a profit off of an event like this. And I just fundamentally, I feel like Spike has blown a lot of opportunities. I mean, they're not building anything with Bellator. Bellator is like UFC Junior. And the problem with the UFC is they don't build stars. They sell UFC guys fighting. And over time, stars can emerge in that system, but it's kind of random and outside the control of the UFC. And over time, they get worn down, and the same thing happened with Bellator. Instead of building more and more stars like Pride was a star-making machine. Even Strikeforce was a star-making machine, but UFC is not, and Bellator is not. And Bellator needs to change their game and realize, look, we're the Strikeforce, we're the Pride. We need to be the spectacle, the sizzle, the sexy. And having these ongoing bitter relationships with their fighters, where their goal is to, let's get this fighter, once we sign somebody, let's trap him in a spider web he can never escape. And if you win a tournament, we extend your contract another 18 months or 3 more fights. If you win a championship, we extend it again, like so that you could theoretically, if you kept winning in Bellator, never escape from your contract. Now, the Muhammad Ali Act was written to protect boxers from that kind of contractual bullshit, and it's way past time for MMA fighters to have the Muhammad Ali Act apply to them. And it's shameful that John McCain, who was such a big advocate of the Muhammad Ali Act for boxers, has done nothing to advance that, and fighters need to organize and lobby for that Muhammad Ali Act, and fans need to organize too, because what benefits fans is if fighters have the flexibility. We thought, oh yeah, if there was a monopoly, one ring to rule them all, then we'd get all the great fights we want. Well, the deal is, life's too complicated. You're never going to get all the great fights you want. Even if you have everybody in the UFC, you don't necessarily get all the great fights you want. There's matchups. I wanted to see Babalu Sobral against Vitor Belfort. They were both in the UFC for years. Never saw it. It's you don't always get what you want. That's just the facts, no matter what system. And I think the system that got fans the most fights, got fighters the most opportunities, was back 10 years ago, when fighters would bounce from promotion to promotion. They might fight in the UFC, this fight, next fight be in Pride, then be in Rumble on the Rock, then be in Cage Rage, et cetera, just bouncing forth. Fighters had a lot of freedom. There were a lot of different competing promotions, but UFC Zuffa has tried to establish a monopoly on the sport worldwide. Strikeforce, when they bought Strikeforce, that was basically a kill shot to competition. Spike and Bellator are the most serious competition they're facing at this point, and I really want Bellator and Spike to pull their heads out of their asses and do this thing. I mean, they did things like have the hour-long special about King Mo and overhyped him, and that he was going to fight and do TNA. And it's very clear you can't be a professional mixed martial artist and a professional pro wrestler at the same time. They're both very demanding practices. Luke Thomas, etc., just hates pro wrestling, etc., etc. I've got immense respect for it. I'm not a fan anymore. I was a fan when I was a kid, but it is soap opera, which is a complicated skill set of acting, combined with like a ballet level of fake fighting. I mean, if you're going to put on an entertaining fake fight, that's an art form. And I think those guys need to be respected for the art form they do, and it's very different from the art form of actually fighting. It's an entirely different thing. Some guys can do both, but some rock guitar players can play jazz. Very few can, and they're both exceedingly demanding disciplines. So why push people to try to do both? Anyway, I'm just rambling, but I got a lot of thoughts spinning in my head about this stuff, and you know, I think one of the biggest mistakes I think Spike made was when they canceled that uncensored MMA show, and it seemed like they did it in a fit of pique because Dana White trashed Spike TV in his usual really stupid, insulting style, and next thing they canceled their show that covered UFC, and it was such a lose-lose because that kind of shoulder programming is exactly what the UFC had on Spike and no longer has with the Fox deal. With Spike, they could get 1 million eyeballs on any kind of programming they wanted to. So when they had a big pay-per-view or a big fight to sell, they could do prime times and countdowns and get, you know, 1 million, 1.5 million viewers for every episode. Now they don't even do prime times anymore because the viewership on FS1 is so low, it's not financially rewarding to do that. So here Spike had this news show that was getting 500,000 viewers a week, and by talking about UFC, they drew in the viewers, but then they could mix and match with the Bellator fighters. And to me, that was a great way to say, hey, here's our product, here's their product, and they're on the same level. You know, here's UFC star Nick Diaz, here's Bellator star Eddie Alvarez, and you know, you have the Bellator guys coming back and forth with UFC guys, and you could also use that as a fucking hammer if you were pissed at the UFC, do an investigative report. You know, turn Nate Corey or Luke Thomas loose on those guys and rip them a new one. I mean, it was just really dumb and short-sighted. And instead they put on shoulder programming like this counterproductive King Mo special that overhyped a guy who was coming off of a massive staph infection and a series of knee surgeries, and frankly has never been the same fighter since. You know, I mean, King Mo's a very, I wouldn't say charismatic. He's almost got anti-charismatic, but he's a very compelling figure. I think he's almost a tragic figure. I'm fascinated by King Mo. I'd love to talk to King Mo, actually, if you're ever watching this. But then again, I don't know if I would, because he, you know, if you watched him in the cage last night, he's yelling at fans in the stands about who lost. The guy's just so insecure, he lashes out at any criticism. You know, somebody like Chael Sonnen is a complete assbag with this shtick he puts on. But, you know, when you deal with Chael, he gets that it's a joke. You know, you can actually have a great interaction with Chael, even if you rip him. You know, he's cool. You know, he knows you know, spell my name right, get me in the headline. But Mo doesn't get the game. You know, Mo will have this feud with our own Brent Brookhouse that ultimately was really stupid and based on somebody tweeting the N-word at him and linking to one of Brent's stories. I mean, Brent didn't tweet the N-word at you, Cat, man. I mean, Brent's not a racist. Like, I mean, everybody's a racist, but Brent didn't say anything racist about you. That, you know, the people that were saying racist things about you, and I can certainly see being upset about that. That wasn't Brent. You know, what Brent said was, you were making some mistakes with your boxing technique that you were, and you got knocked out for it. And so, you know, like, you just look foolish when you lash out at reporters who are trying to, and analysts, and you know, Brent Brookhouse isn't a pro fighter. I mean, obviously any pro fighter or pro coach would have way more insight than Brent probably, but not necessarily. I mean, we're just all observers sharing our insights. You got to listen to people, what they have to say, and take what you think makes sense, and take what you don't think makes sense and argue against it. But you can't just say, oh, fuck that asshole, blah, blah, blah. I mean, like, threatening to beat up reporters is just a bad idea. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyway, I guess I'll wrap this up now, a little frenzied. Go ahead and give us a like. Subscribe to MMANation.com on YouTube and see all the action. Follow me at KidNate on Twitter. Follow us, read us at BloodyElbow.com. Eugene will be back with Knuckle Up tonight. We'll be back next week. I don't even know what's coming up next. Let me look at the list of UFC events. We'll check Wikipedia in the meantime and figure out what the next UFC event is. There's nothing really major until UFC 173, and even then, that's not that major. So, but we'll give it all the fixins with the vivisections and all that shit. Let me see when the calendar date is. See, this is what I'm talking about with the sloppy and bad. I mean, the regular viewers know that this is how we do things. Yeah, so May 24th, that's next week, I guess. So we'll have the Barrow versus Dillashaw. We'll have a care don't care preview and the vivisection, and you know, you got Cormier, Dan Henderson. I mean, this is a pay-per-view card. Hanan Barrow versus T.J. Dillashaw, and Barrow's one of the great fighters on earth, but he's just not a star. And T.J. Dillashaw is a really good fighter, but he's not a star. This is not a headliner. This is not a fight that wanted to headline a pay-per-view card. Dan Henderson is pretty much past his sell-by date. Henderson versus Cormier, though, I mean, that's a major league fight. That's a great co-main. Lawler versus Ellenberger, that's okay. I'll get to the care, don't care. But I think for the most part, this is looking like another don't care in a big way, and they're asking for $55 for it. That's another thing in Bellator's favor. 35 is less than 55, and that adds up. Anyway, I said goodbyes. Adios, MMA aficionados. This is Kid Nate. We'll see you next time.